Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Young Adulting Podcast. I'm Ben Fraser, and I'm your host, and this is our God Answers series, where we wrestle with life's big questions like, why is Chick-fil-A closed on Sundays? I'm pretty sure you heard that last one too. So, and we're still trying to figure that out. And why the waffle fry cravings just hit the hardest every single time. But even most importantly, we look at how God's truth shows up in our everyday lives. Today, I am really pumped because we get to dive into a topic that's been debated and discussed over centuries now, and that is the resurrection of Jesus. Now, let's be real. There's no way that we can cover every angle in one episode. But that's okay, because what we can do is start a meaningful conversation. And to help us do that, we've got a very special guest here with us today, and that is none other than Ken Kilgore. Ken, it's such a privilege to have you on this podcast. But before we jump into this deep stuff, can you introduce yourself to our listeners and share a little bit about what you do and your connection with our young adults in this community?
Thanks, Ben. Let's see. I have been in this community for a long time. Elisa and I moved to this area right after we got married. We've been married 36 years. Whew. And I've been here at Crossroads on staff for 33 of those years. I came as a volunteer. I was actually the first youth pastor at Crossroads, if you can believe that. That's how awesome. Old I am. So I came over on the Mayflower, and then after that, anyway, so
hold on, isn't Crossroads 36 years old?
Actually, we just had our 35th anniversary.
35th anniversary. Wow.
Yeah,
Isn't that crazy? That's awesome.
So, for me, like I was saying, I guess my tie-in with the young adults would just be, I was a youth pastor initially, and then my wife and I worked with single adults also for a while, and then I was in adult ministry for a while, and then worship and technology, and now mainly just production. But my wife and I started a nonprofit in 2016 called Cultivate. Yeah. The website is cultivatenext.org, and our nonprofit is focused on helping emerging adults prepare for thriving adulthood. So we do things like vocational mentoring, we do pre-marriage mentoring. Right now we're working on starting a independent or transitional living program for young adults who find themselves homeless through no fault of their own and need need a break. We're working on that. That's not actually in place, but we're working on that. So
that's great, man. Wow, thanks for sharing that.
And I used to do a lot of teaching at church in the early days, so that's been a while back. But
so you're a man of many talents, many giftings. Would you say?
I've been accused of that before, yes.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Ken. I know our listeners are eager to dive into this subject to hear about your perspective. So we're going to walk through a few angles of resurrection together, from personal stories to historical evidence, and then even how to talk about it with our friends who might not be sure what to believe in. So, first, Ken, what first drew you into studying or defending the resurrection of Jesus? Was there a moment in a conversation that made you realize how big of a deal resurrection truly is?
I would say that probably happened in stages for me. I don't know, not necessarily clearly defined stages, but this is kind of the way I would think of it. But as a Christian early on, I did realize the importance of the resurrection because of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul basically says, I received, was first passed on to me that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he rose again, that he was buried, then he rose again according to the scriptures. And then he talks about the witnesses. And then he goes on to say, basically, if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, then our faith is in vain. So that kind of hit me with, okay, wait a minute, that's right. So if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, we're really just wasting our time. I mean, we wouldn't be here having this conversation. There would be no church. Right. So that was the early on. And then, as I began to read and study the Bible more, I got more and more interested in apologetics as people would ask questions or as I'd have conversations and people would question stuff. But the big thing on the resurrection was a conference I was at years ago, and the speaker was talking about how kind of this new wave of militant atheists had really been waging war on Christianity and especially the faith of young people. Many young people were being talked out of their faith, but the real problem was they'd never been talked into their faith. Meaning,
that's true.
They did not realize that Christianity is based on the resurrection of Jesus, not the Bible. What the atheists would do is basically just try to take pot shots at the Bible and nitpick the Bible, and kind of the idea of, we blow the Bible up, we blow Christianity up. That's just not the case.
Right.
Christianity is based on the resurrection. We have a Bible because the resurrection happened.
Yeah. Man, that is so good. That is so true. We look at the life of Jesus, and when we can pinpoint to the resurrection, like that's what is essential, like it's foundational for our belief. So on a personal note, is there a story that comes to mind where you really saw the power of resurrection impact someone's life in a real way?
So I remember a few years ago, I had the opportunity to meet with a young man who was, he would have called himself an atheist at the time, but he was willing to have conversations, and we went to lunch several times and basically just, started to present, some evidence and just asked him, hey, look into the evidence. I believe you'll see that, Christianity stands on its own legs because it is founded on a historical event. Anyway, we talked through that, and he did his investigating, and he did come to faith, and I had the privilege of baptizing him here at Crossroads years ago.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, shifting gears just a little bit, Ken. If you were talking to someone, I know you had a really big impact on that young man's life as you just shared that story. If you were talking to someone who's never studied apologetics, how would you summarize the strongest case for resurrection?
Okay. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Okay. The first one would be the minimal facts approach that has been put out there by Dr. Gary Habermas. Now, if you're not familiar with Dr. Habermas, he is recognized basically as the foremost authority on the resurrection. He is at Liberty University right now, but he has degrees in theology and philosophy. He's strong in apologetics. He's a New Testament scholar. What Gary has done from all of his research and conversations with all kinds of other scholars, he takes this approach. If you just take the minimal facts that all scholars would not dispute, all scholars that would allow, based on, regardless of whether they're atheists, skeptics, Christians, anything, if they come, doesn't matter what faith perspective that they come from, if they are a legitimate scholar, he would recognize what they have to say and say, okay, if you take all that body of evidence of what they agree in regard to the resurrection in a statement of fact, you come up with a list of about 6 things. In other words, so think about the power of this. You have a list of 6 statements that all scholars agree on, would not dispute, would not question. So when you take those 6 facts and put them together, the only reasonable explanation for those facts is the resurrection. Just think about that. You're having a conversation with an atheist scholar, and you're saying, you list those, and he talks about a conversation with those guys. You list those things out, and then you say, well, so what do you think about the resurrection? Now, you're asking me to believe in something like Narnia or Oz. There's no empirical evidence for an afterlife, so I can't believe in an afterlife, even if the evidence points to the only explanation being the resurrection. There are people who are predetermined, they have predisposed not to believe. Anything that's supernatural is basically written off So that kind of gets exposed when you have that conversation, with those kind of things, with the scholar, that is. So it's a very powerful approach, when I say it's scholarly, the reason I would say it is because you're talking about scholars and facts they would not dispute.
Right.
And just putting them together in a list and saying, okay, now let's talk about this list. And then they go, well, sounds good, sounds like a good argument, great, right?
Yeah.
But I don't buy the resurrection. So there's another problem we're dealing with here, right?
Yeah, that is insane. Yeah, you can't dispute it in that way.
So Ben, let me give you one other example. Right now, it comes from the books of Luke and Acts, which appear in the manuscript evidence as 2-volume work. That's the way it's circulated. Okay, it's widely accepted that the author of Luke and Acts is the physician Luke, the traveling companion of Paul. He is recognized as a historian, like basically unequaled in his accuracy and detail. In fact, from chapters 13 to 28 in Acts, he lists, I believe it's 84 historical facts that are verifiable, that have to be eyewitness testimony. I mean, either Luke is the eyewitness or he knows the eyewitness of those facts. Okay, so there's tons of credibility about that writing. Now, if we look at the writing itself, it's really important about the dating of that, because one of the approaches to try to discredit the eyewitness testimony about Jesus is to place it late, like in the 2nd century. All right, you can't do that with Luke and Acts, and here's why. Luke gives a sweeping account of the history of the church. The book of Luke ends with the Apostle Paul in prison under house arrest, and also there's no mention of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, we know the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 AD by Titus, the Roman general, and his troops, and we also know that the latest possible date for Paul's execution is 68 AD, more like 67. So if Luke ends his Acts volume with Paul still alive and the temple still standing, and Luke, the gospel, was written before that, writing wasn't real fast with the tools they had. They didn't have computers or
typewriters or all that.
So we know it's even earlier than that. Okay. So then we look at the date of Jesus' crucifixion. Well, the earliest possible date for Jesus' crucifixion is spring of 30 AD, more likely this spring of 33 AD. There's different reasons for that. We'll talk about that now. But if you take that time gap from 30 to 68, that's only 38 years. But there has been some scholarly work done on how long it takes legend to develop. There's a guy named A.N. Sherwin-White who's a professor of the Greco-Roman world. I believe it's Roman Law Society or Society in Roman Law, something like that. He's written a work where in there he looks at the whole idea of how long does it take legend to develop. His conclusion is it takes at least 2 generations for legend to develop. You might ask, well, why is that true? Because the eyewitnesses are all still alive.
That's right.
If even now, after as long as it's been, if you go out and say, well, John F. Kennedy was not really assassinated. That wasn't John F. Kennedy. He didn't really die. There's all kind of conspiracy about John F. Kennedy. What does everybody agree to? He died.
The eyewitness accounts.
And that's based
he
on,
died.
That's right. It's based on eyewitness. In fact, the only reason we know anything about ancient history is eyewitness testimony. But for legend to develop takes at least 2 generations, because all the eyewitnesses are still alive and say, hey, no, that didn't happen. But we know when Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, I mentioned that creed, he gives this body of teaching that already was in existence when he became an apostle. Well, that's way even earlier. That creed has in fact been dated to within at longest 8 years of the death of Jesus, and some would say even just months after Jesus. So Paul ties that creed, that teaching that he received, and he ties it to the eyewitnesses. He mentions eyewitnesses in the account. He talks about Peter and the other apostles and James, and he talks about 500 people who are still alive, basically like saying, hey, go talk to any of these 500 other witnesses besides me and the other guys, right?
Yeah.
So now we have this testimony that's incredibly early. So going back to Luke and Acts, the textual scholars would say that Luke uses some content in his writing from some other sources. Well, if he uses other sources, those sources have to be even earlier than him. Now we're clearly less than 38 years away. Okay, so it's just cool to see how early the eyewitness testimony we have is, and the arguments about legendary, corruption, all this kind of stuff, they just kind of dissipate because there's just not time for that to happen. Man,
Ken, we're so excited to hear more about this in person when you come on the 20th. But here's where it hits home for a lot of us. Many young adults today are surrounded with friends who see faith as one option among many. So how can we talk about resurrection as in a way that is compelling but not pushy or judgmental? And in our generation, let's be honest, we care more about authenticity than authority. And so how do we share the truth of resurrection without sounding like we're just parroting church doctrine?
So can we just have conversations, honest conversations? For example, we have a young person we're building a relationship with, and you say, hey, what do you think about Jesus? And just listen to their responses. What do they think about Jesus? Everybody's got an opinion about Jesus. Everybody's heard of Jesus. Right. Most people have a fairly good view of Jesus, a fairly high view of Jesus. So then listen. So if you asked a young person that question, just somebody you're just getting to know, if you just said, "What do you think about Jesus?" What do you think they're likely to say?
Historian, especially someone that is not a Christian, as we've talked to some young adults that just come in exploring. Their answer is that he's a Christian figure in the Bible that people say that died and rose. People believe in Jesus like that. That's more of a generic answers that you would get.
And then if you so tell me why do you think that? Like where does your opinion from Jesus come from?
When I ask that to them,
yeah, what would they say?
From stories, from church that they've been to when they were young, or they'll say things like from movies.
Have you ever read any of the stories about Jesus yourself?
After faith, but before, it was my grandma that would tell me stories about the Bible, like Jesus in the Bible.
So just having a conversation, trying to listen to what are the responses, go to the next question. Just basically, I think if we can just try to have an honest conversation about who is Jesus, what do you think about Jesus, where did your information from Jesus come? Have you ever looked into what Jesus had to say? And then trying to get to eventually saying, why do you think Jesus was crucified? Like, what do you think was the reason that Jesus was crucified? Now, they're going to have, they may not have an answer for that, but they're going to think something at least.
Yeah.
But if we can at least get a person to talk about why did Jesus die, well, now we've at least got a shot at saying, have you ever really looked into who Jesus said he was?
Yeah. That's a good point. Like having these healthy conversations with people, because I think a lot of times what we see is young adults and other people alike, we step into conversations with having a preset solution or a preset answer for things that we're asking about. And when people come into conversations and discussions, they've already made up their mind on what they want to hear and what they didn't hear at the end of that. So having that open dialogue and being open to conversations is, I think, what you're saying is really good.
I think the thing that's good about that is just, we don't want to approach it as we've got this, script and these pat answers. No, let's find out what they're really thinking. What do they really think? What do they really believe? And then how can I ask them questions to help them open up and think about their own assumptions? Because everybody has assumptions about things. We need to expose, like if we have assumptions about things that are not based on truth, they should be exposed. Mm-hmm. But we don't want to do that. We want to lovingly, gently, lovingly try to guide them into a conversation where they can at least face some of the questions honestly that they should be asking themselves,
Yeah, I think Jesus did that too with his disciples and with people that he was talking to. He always had conversations and healthy dialogue and made sure that he was asking questions to make them think and just not just hear information, but to interact with it, to engage with the question in a way that's meaningful. Thanks for that, Ken. Lastly, what encouragement would you give to someone who says, I believe in God, but I just can't wrap my head around the resurrection? And how would you respond if a young adult came to you and said, I want to believe, but I'm not sure Jesus really rose from the dead?
So I think the first thing I would say is consider Thomas. Mm-hmm. Okay? So Thomas was one of the 12 disciples. And when Jesus first appeared to the disciples together, Thomas was not there. And so when they tell Thomas, hey, Jesus is risen, we've seen him, he says, I ain't going to believe unless I put my hand, But here's the cool thing. Jesus doesn't shun Thomas for doubting. Thomas is just saying, think about this. If you saw Jesus crucified, you saw a spear and you're going, he's dead. He's dead and gone. My hopes are dashed. I thought he was the Messiah that was going to release us from, Roman domination. I'm now disillusioned, right? I've unfollowed Jesus. But now you're saying he's alive? Wait, what? And you're going, I'm not going to believe unless I see the proof. Well, okay. Jesus shows up a week later and he says, okay, Thomas, here you go. This is what you asked for, is proof. Jesus doesn't have a problem with people needing proof. The problem is when people ignore the obvious evidence. Okay, let me here's a little extra tidbit. How can you tell the difference between somebody, if you're in a conversation, how you tell the difference between somebody who's an honest skeptic asking questions versus somebody who's not interested? I love this. I heard Frank Turek give this example because he was in an interview with somebody and they asked him that question. He said, well, what I do if I'm at a conference and I have a question, it's Q&A and somebody's kind of dominating the conversation, I just say, okay, let me ask you a question. If I could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt Jesus rose from the dead, would you follow Jesus? And the answer to that question sometimes is, well, no, I don't like what Jesus taught. Okay, can I talk to you later? Let me get on to somebody who has, because what they just showed you is it's not an evidence problem, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus, if you have an evidence problem, my encouragement to you would be pray and ask him, Jesus, if you're real, would you speak to me? Would you speak to me in a way that I know it's you? And we have many of examples of people, throughout history written books about how Jesus revealed himself to them personally, speaking from his word in a particular way, whatever it was. But asking that prayer, praying that prayer honestly, and then, being willing to look at more evidence if you haven't really seen the evidence and haven't really examined the evidence, to make sure it's not really a case of just not knowing.
Right. I believe that if you genuinely ask God to reveal something and show you something about himself, and you actually pursue it instead of just asking the question and turning your back from it, I believe that he reveals that to you. And if you're asking these questions about resurrection, man, like go to the scriptures, ask God and seek it out. Ken, this has been so good, and I know we're just scratching the surface with all of this, but I think today's conversation will really help a lot of young adults wrestle honestly with a huge question. Thank you again for joining us on the Young and Adulting Podcast. Ken will be with us in person on November 20th to talk in depth about this topic with us and answer any questions that you might have about it. So mark your calendars. Again, November 20th at our Thomas Crossroads Campus, and doors open at 6 p.m. Keep asking those questions.
Yes.
Keep seeking the Lord. And we believe that God is going to do great things through this in your life.
Hope to see you there.
See you on the next one.